people don't want to see a politician standing knee or waist deep in water telling them if you haven't evacuated now, it's too late to do so. They have no interest in a politician. They wouldn't even adhere to a directive from a politician in a disaster. What they do want to see is someone in a uniform giving them directions about what to do, because there's so much more trust in the person with the uniform on than there is with a politician.
I guess to jump straight into it, so I came across your work, Professor, firstly through the program that you teach at Griffith, that we were discussing earlier, the Climate Change Adaptation Program, and you teach a course there, something along the lines of disaster communication. And then I, investigated your work further, and I saw an interview with you and Tara Brabazon, which I thought was excellent. I think Tara is incredibly eloquent and she's very good at asking questions. And I thought it was really interesting to hear your story. Not to repeat that podcast, because people can go and watch that conversation. But I'd be curious to know, in terms of your story, Professor, who are you and how did you arrive at the place that you are at this moment?
So I grew up on a farm. I often kind of joke and say it was a hippie farm, but not a cool hippie farm. So a farm without power, without an inside toilet, and all of those challenges that comes with those kinds of lifestyles. So that got me really interested as an adult. Didn't really appreciate it as a child, but certainly as an adult, it got me reflecting on that experience and how I guess we were really quite self-sufficient. And, I got this interest in nature and in gardening, and that's all emerged in my kind of mid-life stage, reflecting back on those earlier years. So that's really informed my interest in disaster communication. But I began my career as a journalist in regional and rural Queensland, where disasters are a fairly regular occurrence. Well, they certainly were then, and they're a much more regular occurrence now. That got me really interested in talking to people about their experiences with disaster and how they coped with disaster, how they recovered from disaster, but also, more importantly, how they thought about the landscape and the weather and how humans interact with those elements. So after about 6 years of being a journalist in regional and rural Queensland, I went to work for Queensland Health as a communication specialist. And in that period, Queensland Health was undergoing a lot of change, but in that kind of environment, you've got crises and sometimes disasters happening, pandemics. You've also got the kinds of disasters and crisis management that occurs on an everyday basis in that environment. So this was really, on reflection, again, building on those interests I had, but much more in terms of the communication and human element of it, and certainly developing that from my journalism. An opportunity came up to teach a class at a regional university overnight while I was doing that work for the health department. And strangely enough, it was in broadcast journalism, even though I'd never been a broadcast journalist, but because my background is old school print journalism. And I had done some video or actual videos, also old school, and book reviews for the ABC radio in that regional area. So it's kind of familiar with broadcast and have an enduring love for radio. So I did that class. I was one step ahead of the students, and it really got me interested in research and being an academic. And shortly after that, I ended up with a full-time job as an academic. And that was the opportunity to bring a whole heap of interests I had, which were about disasters and communication, regional journalism, and radio all into the future, which was back then it was going to be a 25-year plus future.
Yeah.
And I've maintained that research along the way. So a bit of a long answer to a short question.
No, that's, I think, one thing that we like to talk about on the podcast, or I should say because it's more a book that I've read that I don't stop going on about, but it's essentially positing this idea of cognitive diversity, where you use your subjective experiences in life, whether that's your cultural background, where you grew up, and you apply those in areas which have not been applied before. So, your background growing up in a rural farm, adopting a life of simplicity, and then a deep connection with nature, and applying that in a journalistic sense, and also applying that within a context of disaster communication, which I assume has given you a very rich and niche area of study, and of been able to speak about something that I believe not many other people would be able to speak about it in the way that you can speak about it. And
Thank you.
and I just to touch on the point, because I mean, there's so many areas we can sort of dive into now, but you mentioned that it got being in nature got you in touch with the environment, and caring with it in a way that I guess saw, maybe I'm putting words in your mouth, but you saw you and the environment as something that was equal, something that you felt you connected to, and then obviously because of that you got connected to the idea of disasters, and felt very in tune, or felt very aware of disasters were to struck a chord with you. So I wanted to know, firstly, when you say disaster, can you help us understand what you mean, just to get the definitions out early, and then how your experience with nature has informed your research today?
Yeah, when we talk about disasters, sometimes we are not specific enough. So there are two kinds of disasters. There's human-made disasters and natural disasters. But really interestingly, now people are starting to recombine those two by saying this very interesting thing, which is all natural disasters have a human element to them. So, for instance, where we see major flooding, it's the people that we see being affected because the houses were built in areas where houses really shouldn't be built. So that's where those two things are very much coming back together. But really, a disaster is something that challenges the state, the nation's ability to respond to it and to manage it effectively. It stretches resources sometimes, as we've seen, it breaks resources as well. It's been really interesting in the past few years in Queensland, at least, to see that there is now this idea that you as an individual have to be responsible for yourself and be able to maintain yourself and your family for and possibly even your neighbours and your community for at least 3 days, because the government and emergency management organisations are saying we will not be able to come and get you and save you if you are isolated so you need to have water, food, etc. for at least 3 days. So these are the kinds of things that we look at when we're defining disasters, not just what the on paper definition of a disaster is, but now we're seeing disasters that we would really never have expected, and the scale and extent of them is absolutely challenging not just government and emergency organisations' ability to respond, but even our own individual ability to respond and cope with those things. You asked another question about my own, I think it's kind of my own experiences with disaster and how that informs the work I do, if I've got that right. So when I was living on that not cool hippie farm, my parents went on a holiday for quite a few weeks, took my little brother with them, and I was the only one left home. And I think I was about 16 at the time. And I knew how to operate the fire pump and the water pump and everything. And we had some catastrophic fires in the area that we lived in. And anyway, I thought it's all right. I can, I know how to get the fire pump going and the hose and operate the bore, start the generator, all of that. And a couple of young police constables turned up to the farm and said, "Oh, you need to leave." And I kind of laughed at them and said, "Yes, no, I am not leaving." And the looks on their faces, I can remember it to this day. They were just so astounded that a 16-year-old girly girl in a frock was standing there going, "Yeah, I can't leave because my parents will kick my if
Yeah.
I leave."
Yeah.
Anyway, so they were just kind of looking at each other, shaking their heads, going, "I've got no idea what to do here," and off they went.
Yeah.
Anyway, I operated the
Mm.
pump and made sure that the embers didn't come near the house, and it
Mm.
was all good. But of course, when the parents came home from their adventure, I was in the biggest trouble of my life. "You should have gone." And I think that has really underpinned my thinking about disasters and communication about disasters,
Mm.
because there was no communication between my parents and myself at
Mm.
that point about what happens if there is a disaster while you're away. Do I stay? Do I go?
Absolutely. And I think as well that puts you in a very peculiar and unique spot, because it allows you to be much more empathetic with those that are currently experiencing whatever disaster it may be, a forest fire, a flood, and be able to understand the indecisiveness of action. And I think you also mentioned this before. It also, there's a political undertone of what is the politics of the day. So if you have someone if you have a government that is a bit more right leaning, that is less about a government intervention and more about individual liberty, you can see how that would color the discourse of what to do in a disaster. And likewise, if it was a more left leaning government, how government intervention would be deemed as the correct form of dealing with crisis. But it really paints a very brilliant picture, I think, of the complexity of disaster communication in a very simple story. And I think it also shows our international listeners that Australia is indeed quite a crazy place with with all sorts of interesting things going on. And so I suppose uh, now that we've touched on what a disaster is briefly, and you've given that really beautiful story, can you help us understand what your line of work is in terms of disaster communication? Because I think intuitively people understand what that means, but I'm sure that there's nuances of that research.
One of the things that characterizes my research is looking at public communication of disasters. So there's multiple arms to that. For instance, there's a research project around the involvement of politicians in communicating about disasters, because you only have to turn your television or your radio on when there's a disaster to see that politicians want to get involved. So looking at how those processes can be managed to ensure effective communication with publics. And I'll give you just a little example there, that people don't want to see a politician standing knee or waist deep in water telling them, if you haven't evacuated now, it's too late to do so. They have no interest in a politician. They wouldn't even adhere to a directive from a politician in a disaster. What they do want to see is someone in a uniform giving them directions about what to do, because there's so much more trust in the person with the uniform on than there is with a politician. So there's that kind of political communication aspect. And then there's generally looking at news media coverage of disasters, because yes, social media does play a big role, and other people are researching social media and disasters communication. but people still turn to television if they're at home, or radio if they're mobile, when there's a disaster on. In particular, our national broadcaster during emergencies tends to be the go-to point for people to get trusted and reliable information. So within that kind of project, not just looking at and analysing coverage, what happened, what could be done better, but also looking at journalistic practices during disasters. Because of course journalists come under extreme scrutiny, probably in the aftermath of a disaster, in terms of how they've behaved, what actions they've taken, whether they've contributed to pain and suffering and misery that people have experienced during these events. So that's really the big focus around public communication.
Yeah, that's very interesting. So I guess just to touch on just to summarize, so obviously you talked about there's multiple arms of what public communication entails when it concerns disaster communication. So we have how our government officials or representatives communicate to their electorates and to the wider community, and then you also have just the more general news media, how media is conveyed, what is said, how it's said, in which way it's being said. And then you also mentioned some really interesting research where you said within a disasters that people actually don't really care much for what the politicians have to say or something to that effect, but rather they just want to be directed by that authority in that area, whether that's like a fire, the head of the fire department or whoever is involved. And you also mentioned for the news media, something you were talking about is journalistic practices. And I'd be curious to know how do bad journalistic practices play into bad disaster communication or even good disaster communication?
If we're thinking about the kinds of things that journalists might do, one really simple example is the language that they use around a disaster. And it's really quite fascinating that journalists and presenters tend to, I guess we could call it, anthropomorphize disasters. You know, they give these disasters human characteristics. And if I take the example of a cyclone, in America, you would call this a hurricane, but in Australia, we call them cyclones, and they all get female names. So the cyclone, you know, is doing things such as a person would do, beating down on, you know, devastating, causing devastation, as if it's deliberately doing these things. They will often refer to a cyclone as she did this or she did that, you know. So these things can be really problematic because people start to see this disaster as the thing that is the problem, when the thing that is the problem is the way we respond to them and the way we prepare for them and the way we manage the outcomes of those disasters. The disaster would happen whether we were here or not. You know, the cyclone would maybe not so often because humans have, you know, contributed to, if not caused, climate change, which results in more of these types of events. But as Indigenous Australians say, you know, the disasters were here way before the people were. So yeah, it's about the wording, it's about the language, the communication, but it's also about what they do when they're engaging with people affected by disasters.
Yeah, and I'm reminded of a story that happened very recently. So there's this God forbid me using this word, influencer that was on a plane traveling somewhere recently, I think to Africa, and in the middle of the plane, the pilot said, "Oh, excuse me, everyone, we have a fuel leak, so we'll have to turn around." And then obviously everyone started panicking, and he sort of video records his experience of listening to this, and he's sort of sobbing in the bathroom saying, you know, I don't know what's going to happen. It's very dramatic because, you know, the pilots just said there's a fuel leak. I don't know if we're going to get back in time. They land back safely. Everything's fine. And then obviously the airline comes out and apologizes because my understanding is that the fuel leak was such that it would actually not pose any material danger to anyone. However, the language that was used in that moment caused such a stir to create imminent fear within people. And I think that is, if I was to tie that back to what you're saying, things like language, whether we anthropomorphize, whether we just use particular words that are maybe hyperbolic or that could be misinterpreted by lay people, it is a very important thing in public communication. And one wrong step, I imagine, can lead to a very it can lead to a cascading chain effect of I guess Chinese whisperers or people not understanding what the actual intent or the actual message was to begin with. Would you say that's about right?
Oh, absolutely. That's a really good summary of what goes wrong.
Mm.
So you could use a similar example where people will say things like, "Oh, this is a 1 in 100 year flood." Now, people think that means it should only happen every 100 years, but it actually doesn't mean that. It means something completely different. And I'll give you another example,
Mm.
and it's not just politicians and journalists, but even people managing disasters,
Mm.
who, I will say it, are bound by legislation and manuals and, you know, all the kinds of policy and directives. But there's something that is said during disasters, particularly floods, where it's a terminology where that people are told to evacuate in place.
Mm.
And I ask people, just as a little, not a formal research project, but just as a little test wherever I go, if I'm in a cab or an Uber, do you know what evacuate in place means? And most people have no idea what that means.
Yeah.
It actually means you need to get into your ceiling or onto your roof in your house or whatever structure you're in.
Yeah.
But most people will go, I've got no idea what evacuate in place means.
Mm.
So this kind of terminology, this language is very confusing to people who are under extreme stress or duress and maybe aren't able to process cognitively the words as they normally would. So we really need to think about saying things like, get on your roof if you can.
Yeah. Yes, yes. It seems painstakingly obvious, and yet I suppose that's the point of the research, to say these things do need to be researched because they can have completely far-reaching consequences if you just say exit on at place as opposed to get to your roof, and can even potentially cost lives, which is obviously the worst case scenario, or one of the worst case scenarios.
Absolutely. And one of the things that I really love about the research I do,
Mm.
even though it's traumatic and it's
Mm.
awful, it's that we can make a difference.
Mm.
And we feed our research back to industry, to government, and
Mm.
say, look, this is what we're finding, and here's what we suggest be changed as a result of that.
Mm.
So it's really exciting as a researcher to think that amidst all this terrible, you know, disaster, the crises, that you actually can possibly have a little bit of impact and effect.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I wanted to very quickly, Professor, touch on one story, one point, and then we can dive into maybe the elements that make up really good disaster communication, or that break bad a good disaster communication. So there was this airline flight. I forget what exactly where it was. I think it was from Denver to someplace in America, essentially. And what had happened was, whilst the plane was coming to descend and to land, the landing gear had some sort of issue where essentially the button that would like light up when the landing gear was engaged was not lighting up. So the pilots and the engineers in the flight were unable to actually determine for certainty whether the landing gear was whether it was engaged or not. So they were circling and circling and circling, and what ended up happening was, because of the intensity of the moment and trying to figure out what was happening, the plane ended up running out of fuel and the plane ended up crashing. And I think a number of lives were taken as a result of this issue of being so focused onto one thing. And I think biochemically speaking, what happened was the adrenaline allowed their focus to collapse on the moment that was occurring, rather than thinking of the wider implications. Yeah. And so it seems like in this moment, when in a moment of crisis or in a moment of high pressure, people can make really bad decisions, or decisions that could have been avoided are not. So I was wondering, like, is there anything you've found in terms of when people are in a crisis, how they respond to crises, and how they communicate their way out of that? If you found anything of that sort?
I'm just trying to think back through the examples and studies that we've done. So
yeah, and feel free to take your time as well.
Yeah, I'm just trying to think of, in those 10 countries where we interviewed top senior emergency managers, I think the hint that they give, or the tactic that they use, is to shift focus. Okay. So when you're really intensely caught up in a moment and you probably aren't seeing the big picture, because in a disaster there'll be multiple places that will be on fire or flooding. You probably are just focused on the next place that's going to catch fire, or the one that's on fire, and shifting focus to look out for them to the big picture seems to be the way that they stop that collapse happening. And when you look out and see the big picture, you can sometimes see patterns, as these emergency managers explained, that you don't see when you're in that collapsing situation.
Absolutely.
So I think even on an individual level, if you're facing a disaster and you're just thinking about one thing and you're doing that, and it's such a great term that you use there, that kind of collapsing inwards, if you can find a way to break that and to stop and just even take 5 seconds and look, what's the big picture here? Is it just my forest in my backyard on fire, or is it happening everywhere? If it's happening everywhere, that means I can't get out of where I live. And I live in a fire zone and there's only one way out. So if it's happening everywhere, then it means I have to decide to do something different. For instance, stay and fight the fire. But if it's only happening in my backyard, but it looks like it's going to spread, then I still have the opportunity to leave. Instead of doing that thing where you're just so caught up in the moment that you're missing opportunities that could actually mean the difference between saving your life and not.
Absolutely. And I think that really ties in well, because if those pilots in that situation were to shift their focus for a moment, they would have been able to easily see the fuel indicator obviously ticking down. And so it's a very, I think, interesting way of reframing the situation as another way of viewing it. But to go back onto disasters, so obviously there's a number of disasters that are happening at the moment to do with climate change. So the floods in Pakistan and in Oman, and then there's droughts and all sorts of things. And then we've also just gone through maybe the biggest disaster in the 21st century, which is, or I don't know if you'd classify this as a disaster, it'd be interesting to hear, but going through COVID and the management or mismanagement of health outcomes, of vaccine rollouts, all those sorts of things. So we've gone through these two, we're going through both of them at the moment, and they're both incredibly significant. And I would like to get to better understand, I guess, using these as an example, what are like the most important elements of effective communication, and how do these two examples or any other examples demonstrate this, or show to demonstrate how, if they're not done, can lead to these sort of things happening?
Yeah, the COVID example really brings out this very important lesson,
Mm,
that when something like a pandemic happens, and you can apply this to disasters and other crises as well, uh, every agency dealing with the response to that needs to be on the same page.
mm,
And that was not the case with COVID. And if we even just cycle back to Australia, small spot in the big international picture, local, state, and federal governments were not effectively communicating with each other, let alone with the public. So we were getting confused messaging from different levels of government. You know, federal government saying one thing at 9 o'clock on Friday, state government completely counteracting
mm,
that advice, those directives at 9:10 on Friday.
mm,
So these are the kinds of things that governments need to ensure, that they all have the same message, and that it's all going out at the same time, with the same consistency.
mm,
Because the thing that really erodes the confidence, whether it's public officials like chief health officers,
mm,
or whether it's politicians, and again, people would be much more inclined to, get that solid health advice from a chief health officer rather than a politician.
mm.
But regardless of who is giving the message, the thing that erodes public confidence is when these messages are at odds with each other.
Mm.
And in fact, what people then do is they freeze. They get to a situation where they're going, well, those people are saying I should do this, but these people are telling me that. And in a life-threatening situation, they can actually do that freezing, where they go,
Mm.
I've got no idea what to do, what's going on here.
Yeah.
Um, in a situation like COVID, what
Mm,
happened is, because the messaging was conflicting about who's an essential worker, who isn't,
mm.
what are the restrictions? It's almost as bad as the GST when it was introduced. Actually, no, it's far worse, because the GST was only about money.
Yeah.
COVID was about lives.
Mm,
Um, so that was a really bad example for me to use.
mm,
But, it's the point really that I was trying to make was the confusion just reigned. And
mm,
even when governments knew that people were confused, they still didn't say, okay, let's all just stop for a moment, let's
mm,
get on the same page, and let's go forward from here
mm.
and make sure that this confusion doesn't continue.
Yeah, and it was almost like a perpetual state of confusion, where it wasn't only over like the first initial period, but it was over countless months, where the head scientists, so for, like, I guess in America, the Dr. Fauci, I think the one example that stands out is mask wearing, because I remember at the start, mask wearing, I don't think it was, I think there was a bit of confusion whether masks were effective or not. And I think the Fauci said that they weren't, and then he said they were, something along to that effect. Maybe I want to be very careful, but essentially it could have been any sort of similarity where a scientist or a politician says one thing, then they say another, and that completely it leads to, like you said, a lack of confidence, a lack of authority, a lack of assurance. Which, going back to the research that you mentioned before, people just want experts to tell them what to do,
Yeah.
and they don't want any they don't want any gray. They just want black and white, so they can be assured, and then I guess cover their most basic needs. It's the need for security and safety, and when that's threatened, it seems like people are willing to do all sorts of interesting things, like create bans of people that don't want to be vaccinated, because there's been so much mistrust that has been created by a lack of authority, or authority misstepping here and there.
Yeah. And all of that comes back to public communication. What were the public told about these vaccines? How was it communicated? You know, there was some inconsistency in the way it was talked about, how it was developed, and all of these things just put seeds of doubt in people's minds, which then, you know, Australia is, like the rest of the world, not immune to conspiracy theorists. It then gives rise to that kind of almost hysterical kind of responses and reactions.
Mm.
Uh, I mean, some of the conspiracy theories that came out in COVID-19 were just mind-boggling, really.
Yeah.
But one thing we found in our research, and this really emerged from some massive floods in Queensland in 2010 and 11, where 2/3 of the state was underwater. So, you know, a catastrophic event, really. What we found then is that the politician who was in charge of the state of Queensland, the Premier at the time, Anna Bligh, actually modelled fantastic public communication around the disaster. She was not out there knee deep in water. She was in the emergency management centre. Every time there was a press conference, anything televised, she had key people beside her, the police commissioner. At that point, the army was called in as well. So she had a major general with her. And she was doing what politicians should do, showing empathy, saying that she would give all the support she could financially to these organisations to respond. But whenever anyone asked an operational question or anything about what people should do, she handed over to the expert, to the people who were managing and responding to that disaster. So this is a really great way of ensuring public confidence, and also ensuring that people actually do what they need to do when there's a disaster happening.
Yeah, absolutely. And it seems like, and perhaps correct me if I'm wrong, Professor, but I'm getting a sense that doubt is one of the most devastating factors in poor communication, and or in communication in general, and not only in communication, but just having an understanding of what to do next or what to believe. Because I mean, there's a fantastic book called Merchants of Doubt, which is essentially all about how fossil fuel companies adopted the playbook of the tobacco industry to sow doubt in the minds of consumers, to I guess kick the can down the road in terms of climate mitigation. And it's so bad now that, I mean, even in our parliament, I think just yesterday when the climate bill was passed, the opposition party are using, I guess, phrases of climate denialism, which have directly can be founded in the 60s and 70s, when doubt was being casted by these industries, which to me is which seems like the most devastating impact. But I think also as well, it seems to be a seed of empathy within your research that I'm sensing, which is doubt and a lack of authority. And as a result, everything that comes from that, like conspiracy theories, is a direct result of poor communication, where if that was avoided, perhaps none of this would have happened. And so it almost seems like, and perhaps I may be misinterpreting this, but it's my sense that we have to be culpable for whatever comes of poor communication in terms of governments, officials, and experts. Is that correct, or am I taking that a step too far?
Yeah, the doubt is absolutely the killer. That is and it can literally be the killer. If you don't know what to do, if you're getting conflicting messages, then, you know, that can be the freezing moment, as I mentioned earlier. And absolutely, governments, politicians, emergency managers, anyone giving any directions need to be absolutely clear in what they mean at the time. They need to direct people specifically, this is what you need to do, this is when you need to do it. And, you know, this is what will happen if you don't take this action.
Mm,
So, you know, some people choose to stay and fight fires to save
mm,
livestock, to save their house, etc. And that is okay,
mm,
as long as they're completely aware that no one is coming to save them, and that they make that choice in a fully informed and well, you know, they're well communicated with when they make that choice.
mm,
Um, and sometimes it turns out well, and sometimes it turns out absolutely devastatingly.
mm,
So yes, it is the job of government and
mm,
emergency managers and management organisations to communicate properly and clearly with the public when these events occur.
mm,
And yes, we don't like, in our research, we think the blame game is a terrible thing,
mm,
because this is what journalists do after a disaster. And in fact, in the last Queensland floods that happened very recently, they were doing it during the floods.
mm,
They went searching for who was to blame for the floods.
mm,
And that is not actually helpful at that point. But I think responsibility being taken by agencies and people who
mm,
communicate is absolutely crucial to making sure that doesn't happen next time.
mm, mm. And it uh, and it reminds me of this idea of I guess positive psychology of and what's it called? The word escapes me now, but this idea that failure, or even that seems to me a bit of a loaded word, but treating disasters, or when a negative occurrence happens, and then trying to, like you said, point the blame, is actually one of the worst outcomes that can happen. And one of the best outcomes that can happen is we actually investigating the source. Where did this come from? And then figuring out a solution. And that way, what will happen is, firstly, according to this research at this hospital, because they did this at a hospital where doctors were punishing nurses or junior doctors for making mistakes. And this is quite a common response, because liability is a very big issue within the medical field. And doctors and junior doctors don't report their mistakes in that case, because they know they're going to get in trouble. But they did this research at this hospital where they adopted this approach where they say, okay, let's put all our cards on the table. You report everything in good faith, and let's research it. And they found that liability insurance reduced by 75%. Mistakes increased dramatically, but it's not because more mistakes happened, it's because more people reported mistakes. And then as a result, less patients were impacted by mistakes, because they were able to figure out the problem and resolve it. And then they'll be able to make things better. And that sounds like a very similar thing that's happening with what you're describing.
Yes, so yeah, searching for who is to blame probably solves a problem in terms of things like liability insurance, but it doesn't actually, you know, because you can then say, well, that person might lose their job, or they might face a law court or a civil suit, but it doesn't actually solve the root cause of why is this not just occurring once, but occurring quite frequently.
Mm, mm,
You know, for me, I'm still really interested in why people choose to drive through floodwater,
mm,
despite all of the public communication we have about how stupid that is, let alone how dangerous. People still make that choice. But what we don't know, which I find even more interesting, and I always look for what's not there. You know, that's one of the things in my research. What isn't there? So what's not there in this instance is how many people choose not to drive through floodwater.
yes,
We
yeah.
have no idea. We know how many people do, because inevitably they end up stuck and
Mm.
worse consequences. But
Yeah.
we don't. Oh, and the other thing we often don't know with the people who unfortunately die as a result of driving through floodwater, into floodwater, is why they made that choice. How
Yeah.
did they weigh up the risk associated with that?
Mm.
What was it that they really felt that they needed to do that caused them to drive through floodwater?
Mm. 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 Yeah, and I think it all ties into the different fields of research. So it seems like disaster communication is also inherently can be an interdisciplinary sort of research field where you're tying in psychology, neuroscience, and all sorts of interesting other things, which I probably know nothing about. So I wanted to play a little bit of a game, Professor, if you'll indulge my playfulness. So I'm going to say we are going to, let's say someone knocks on your door and says, Professor, your research is fantastic. We need a head of research. We need a head of disaster communication to inform the state or the prime minister, whoever in whatever the situation is. And so they instate you in this position, and then they ask, okay, so it's been a mess in the past, but what are some things that you can help us do better? What are some of the ways that, as an at an institutional level, and maybe even on a media level, like how can we make our communication better? What would be the bullet points, or maybe the just one point that you would pass on to them to make sure that disasters, a bad communication can be avoided in disasters?
I would say choose your words very carefully and consistently.
Mm.
Build relationships when disasters aren't happening.
Mm.
So we've now got less time to do that, but we still have time. Build relationships with other government levels, emergency organisations, so that those relationships are really strong, and so that you can be clear, consistent, and everyone can be on the same page when it comes to the words and the meanings that are conveyed before, during, and after disasters.
Mm.
I say after disasters because one of the things that annoys a lot of researchers is the very flippant use of the word resilience.
Mm.
Uh, because when people are told that, well, how come you haven't, or are asked, how come you haven't recovered from that disaster? It's been 2 years. Your neighbours have recovered. What's wrong with you? You're not very resilient, are you? It's not helpful. In fact, it's actually really quite damaging
Mm.
because everyone's circumstances are different. Maybe the neighbours didn't have their children die in a disaster. That's why those people are not going to ever recover. They will continue to live and their lives will be different, but their, recovery and resilience for them is not helpful at that time.
Mm. Absolutely. Well, if I was prime minister, I think I'd be very reassured in that moment. Uh, I,
If I was working for the Prime Minister, no, I'd be running out the door if it was someone from the Prime Minister's office. And it's not a political thing, it's just working for politicians is not fun.
yeah.
But I would say to politicians, listen to the emergency managers. They are the experts.
Mm.
And also listen to the academic researchers, because we want to help you. We
Yeah.
do all this research and we are here to help you. Ring me up during a disaster.
Mm.
Um, Anastasia Palaszczuk,
Yeah.
Anthony Albanese, ring me up during a disaster. You can find my phone number quite easily.
Yes,
And
and we'll display it on the screen right now. The number will pop up.
and ask my advice. It's free. I'm paid by the public.
Mm.
I'm here researching on the public dollar. There is no reason why they can't ring me and go, hey,
Mm.
what would you advise for the forthcoming fire season? How
Mm.
should we communicate? It's free. I've got the information, and all of my colleagues who are academics doing research in this area, we would love to get those phone calls.
So it seems like, and perhaps this is a legacy from the previous tenure of the government, but it seems like there's this disconnect in terms of uh, expert getting expert opinion on really important issues, and also politicians, in a sense, white knighting issues where they feel that they have to take on all the responsibility and then also try and come up with all the solutions rather than just deferring to authority, which, like you were saying, in most situations, that's what people want. And I also imagine this is quite a very, what I would imagine is like a very difficult time for disaster communication or communication in general, where we're living in a post-Trump era, a post-truth era, where people can say fallacious things, they will spread 10 times faster. There's a professor, I think Carl Bergstrom in the United States, where he does a class on basically misinformation and how quickly it can spread. And especially with social media now, you can basically spread any message. And I think COVID was a really good example where conspiracy theories thrived. And it's the same with, climate change, where conspiracy theories can also thrive in the midst of poor communication, poor messaging, authority figures not taking responsibility or a lack of responsibility. It seems like this would be a really, really hard time to communicate effectively. Do you know how does a post-truth era of misinformation impact effective communication, aside from the very obvious, everything's going wild on TikTok, so to speak?
It's such an important point that now because of the conspiracies that have come out, in this post-truth era, they get taken up much more quickly than they would have been previously. Also, as you were saying, through social media, they're promulgated. What we then have is news media taking those up and sometimes erroneously repeating them, or even in making fun of them. They're actually exposing a whole heap of people who may not have known about them, who then go, oh, there could be a kernel of truth in that. So people go down those, wormholes and start engaging with that. So what do we do to overcome that? I think it all comes back to, it's the moment something happens and the people, whoever's managing the response and communicating about it, they need to stop and actually think really carefully about what words are we going to use, because every word has weight and it has power, and how are we going to communicate this to the public? Quite often people will think, oh, we just need to get out there and start talking about it. But you actually need to take a breath and think, how are we going to talk about this? Because it's in that moment where any little stumble, any kind of error could then be grabbed by these conspiracy theorists and, misused. So it is absolutely crucial that people think about that, because even though people still do use social media for information about crises and disasters, all the research shows that it's radio that people turn to when a disaster happens.
Oh, wow. That's very interesting.
Yeah. And, radio, as I've mentioned at the beginning of our discussion, I love radio. Radio is fantastic. There's a radio in every room in my house. And, shower radio is great, right? Shower radio.
I think I'll have to take that up the next shower I take, just buy a radio.
You can use your mobile phone and
Oh,
get
yes.
speaker. But when we're turning to radio immediately for information, because we want to know what's happening between news bulletins, although that's interesting in itself, TV is now covering these disasters 24/7. We've just got this repeated coverage happening from the scene, the people engaging in public communication, it's all about the messaging, and how much trust can people put in that messaging. So one false step, you're opening the door for all of those conspiracy theorists, and that is not helpful. And we've seen the outcome of that in COVID, for instance.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm very tempted to ask a self-indulgent question because it's something I've been thinking about quite often, but I wanted to get your take on it, given that you come from a more journalistic background and also your research now. Like I was mentioning at the beginning, in my experience and my co-host experience, the memories of the podcasts that we do that stand out the most are when guests have told stories. And I think this plays into our narrative sort of sense of conceiving of the world and our memories. And it's a very indigenous perspective where indigenous tribes have been telling stories for thousands of years, and they've lived to this day just through just orally. And to me, this seems like if you want to leave an imprint of something in someone's memory, facts and figures, although they're important, are not going to be the things that are remembered, but the narrative that is being told will be. And I'm saying this in a very rhetorical way, as to seem maybe the point has more merit, but I actually don't know, and I would like to get a sense from you. How does how does storytelling play into disaster communication? If it does, I don't know if it's useful or not. Maybe it's not, but I'd like to get your thoughts.
We love storytelling, and this comes up all the time. I'm involved in a disaster management network at Griffith University, and we were having a meeting the other day, and I said, just bear with me a moment, I need to tell this story. And everyone went, well, we love stories. So clearly and this is interdisciplinary, so clearly storytelling for academics doing research around disasters is really important. When it comes to public communication, I think we haven't harnessed the power of the story. And I'm really excited now because I think there's something absolutely fantastic there that you've hit on. If we can tell the story of what went wrong and what went right in disasters, and we can convey that publicly, in easy to understand ways without traumatizing people, then we're all traumatized, I think.
Yes,
by
absolutely.
what's happening in the world. I think there's some real potential to prevent some of the problems that have occurred in previous disasters. Everyone loves a good story. I'm speaking from an Australian perspective. We are the greatest storytellers. I'm sure everyone in every country thinks that they're the greatest storytellers, but Australians can spin what we call a yarn, which is a story. And, we're great tall tale tellers as well. We love to exaggerate our stories.
Yes.
But I think there's something there for public communication.
Absolutely. Well, I'm very tempted to keep going on and on and on and on, Professor, because I have 1,000 questions, but I have to exert some prudence here. As the last question to ask, we ask this to all of our guests. Our channel's called Utopias now, and what we ask our guests is we want to understand what your utopia would be, what would look like, whether that was on a day-to-day basis or just certain elements that you'd prefer. But yeah, whether that was in a storytelling format or in just a descriptive format, we'd love to know what your utopia would look like.
I have to start this by saying that I always say to my my friends and sometimes some of my trusted colleagues that I call myself the ultimate pessimistic optimist. Pessimistic optimist. And they go, well, what's that? And I say, well, I always expect the worst, the absolute worst with, you know, testing, trying situations, because when it doesn't happen, I am so happy. I am so happy. And
Yes.
so, you know, I don't own this car, but I'm driving a 1968 fastback Mustang down the freeway and it catches fire, and I jump out and people are going, oh, you must be devastated. And I'm going, no, I'm alive. You know, the car's on fire. It's, you know, it's gone, but I'm really happy because I'm alive. So I tell that, I explain that to you because this is really my version of utopia, where we are prepared for the worst. The worst doesn't happen, but because we're so prepared for the worst, in terms of response management and communication above all, that when the worst doesn't happen, then we have communicated and managed and prepared in a way that has ensured the worst doesn't happen. So that, I think that's utopia for me.
It sounds like effective expectation management, and I think that's the way to go.
I'm glad you mentioned expectation management, because I'm right into expectation management. And you may or may not use this bit on the podcast, but you know, when people spread rumors about you and it comes back to you and people say, oh, everyone knows such and such about you, I now just expectation manage. And when I hear that, I start to mirror that behavior back to people and go, if you expect me to be like that, I will be like that.
I think that's a tip and trick that we all have to adopt and manage those situations much better.
But wouldn't it be great in disaster land if we took up expectation management, where we said to people, this is what we expect you to do, and people went, well, I'll do that then.
Yeah, absolutely. This is it's very interesting. I mean, I think it's to that point of when you expect people to be a certain way, then they will show you that. And I think in education there's a particular word, I think it's called what's it called? The Pygmalion effect, where when teachers expect students their ability in a particular way, there was some research on it, basically showed like if you treat students like they're silly, they will then they will feel that and they will emulate that in their responses. Whereas if you treat students really well, they will feel like they're really good students and they will perform better. And so yeah, I think it's all about, you know, expectations are really important. But nevertheless, I'm digressing now. I wanted to say thank you very much, Professor, for joining me. But I really wanted to say thank you for coming on. I have a lot of gratitude for you speaking with me and sharing your research. And I hope Albo is watching so he can take some good notes.